Hello and welcome to today's lecture on the Great Depression in Washington State. So, in a previous lecture, we overviewed the causes of the Great Depression in the United States, beginning in 1929. We talked about the Hoover administration's response to the Great Depression, its inadequacy, and the reasons for its inadequacy. We talked about the election of 1932 and Roosevelt's election and the New Deal, Roosevelt's plan for solving the Great Depression. We talked about the basics of the New Deal. We talked about the basics of the economic theory behind the New Deal, primarily Keynesian economic theory. In this lecture, I just want to spend a few minutes focusing specifically on Washington State to see how people living in Washington experienced the Great Depression and how the programs of the New Deal impacted residents of Washington. So this lecture will be a complementary lecture to the previous ones on the start of the Great Depression and on the New Deal and the election of 1932 and so on and so forth. The first point I'd like to make before we get going here is a reminder. I want to remind you of something we talked about in our lectures on the 1920s, which is that the 1920s were not a good economic era for Washington State. Let me just reiterate that. The 1920s were not a good economic period for Washington State. That actually contradicts the narratives that were often taught and told and understand about the 1920s in American history. Because if you've ever studied American history, right, you know that or broader American history, right, you know that the 1920s are considered the Roaring Twenties, the Jazz Age. It's a period of tremendous economic growth and excess in the United States. Well, as we talked about in the lecture on the causes of the Great Depression, in reality, that economic growth was really restricted to a handful of groups who benefited from those economic industries that were booming. The overall American economy wasn't necessarily booming. What was happening is that heavy industry, light industry for most of the 20s, but especially heavy industry, was exploding. Think like the manufacturing of cars for heavy industry, or the manufacturing of consumer goods for light industry. The United States became the world's factory in the 1920s. And this was compounded by the fact that many of the previous economic giants in the world, many of the other world's industrial economies, were rebuilding and recovering from the devastation of World War I, particularly Great Britain and Germany, but others as well. And so what you have happen is that the boom in a handful of industries in the United States relegated to manufacturing and industry are so great that it's powering the American economy. But underneath there, we have some underlying issues. And I just want to remind you of those underlying issues. We talked about them in the lecture on the start to the Great Depression. But I really want to remind you of these issues right now because they're very germane to the situation and conditions on the ground in Washington State. So overall, what you had was enormous economic inequality, that the wealth being generated by the economic growth in the United States in the Roaring Twenties was really concentrated in the hands of a relatively small percentage of the American population. And so what you had was a situation where the vast majority of Americans were living hand to mouth or making just enough to get by. They didn't have the economic wherewithal to weather a depression because the economic gains of the Roaring Twenties were not evenly distributed. The other thing to keep in mind is that if your economy, if your local or state economy was based on industries outside of manufacturing, then you probably weren't seeing the benefits of the Roaring Twenties economy. And that is the situation in the state of Washington. Washington in the 1920s and 30s was primarily a natural resource based and agriculture based economy. For sure, we had some manufacturing and some mining. We had some of that. But those industries had largely struggled since the end of World War I. Shipbuilding, which had been an industry in World War I in Washington, wasn't doing as well after the end of the war. And then you start adding in the natural resource based economic industries in Washington, like logging or farming or fishing. And you can start to see where those industries were struggling across the country for the most part during the 1920s. So Washington doesn't have those manufacturing centers that were booming so much in the 1920s. So Washington's economy is fairly stagnant in the 1920s as the Great Depression comes on. And what that means is that Washington's economy and those living in Washington really are not able to weather the conditions of the Depression. They just aren't. So it's a situation in Washington where things just get worse, right? They just get worse. It's not this sudden collapse like you find in places like New York City or Chicago or Detroit, where the economy had been booming for certain groups. In Washington, it's just the case where like difficult economic times, economic struggles just become even worse. They become cataclysmic, to be frank, but it's not like things had been well before. And what that means is that you have an economic instability in Washington that just begins to deteriorate. In a previous lecture, we talked about how across the country, when the economy crashed, people lost their jobs and unemployment was, up to 25%, but maybe even higher, depending on how you want to interpolate those numbers. And that homelessness became a problem with the development of Hoovervilles emerging all over the country in major urban areas. And if you recall, Hoovervilles were basically shanty towns where people took, scrap metal, scrap wood, cardboard, whatever they had to create these makeshift shelters that they could live in. And they tended to be in urban areas because people flocked from the countryside to the cities looking for jobs. Now, these Hoovervilles became symbols of the Depression. If you go and look at historic photos, you can find numerous examples of Hoovervilles. Well, one of the largest Hoovervilles in the entire country, these shanty towns of homeless, unemployed individuals who couldn't find work because of the Great Depression, one of the largest in the country was in the city of Seattle. Now, Hoovervilles, as they were nicknamed, were sort of local and state issues, meaning that there was no federal government policy for how to deal with them outside the city of Washington, D.C., which is under federal jurisdiction. And so it was up to state and local officials to decide what to do about these Hoovervilles, these large encampments of people who were jobless and homeless through no fault of their own. There was no work to be had. There was no work to be acquired. Local authorities looked at Hoovervilles as places of crime and depredation and potential radical politics. Like these might be areas of where radicals or revolutions might emerge. You have to keep in mind that Americans were paranoid about the revolutions they'd seen go on in Europe, whether it was the communist revolutions in the Soviet Union and beginning at the end during World War I in 1917 with the Bolshevik Revolution, or whether it was fascist movements that had emerged all over Europe, beginning in Italy in 1922, but then ultimately, most famously emerging in Germany in 1933 with the Nazis coming to power. So fascism on the far right, or communism on the far left, there were fears of these sort of revolutionary, violent politics maybe emerging in the Hoovervilles. And so state and local officials all over the country, but especially in Washington, were eager to prevent that from happening. Now, it's important to understand Hoovervilles were not anyone's ideal place to live. It's that the economic situation of the Great Depression meant people had nowhere to go. There were no jobs in the countryside, so they flocked to the cities because at least there might be work in the cities. But then there wasn't work in the cities. If you don't have work, you can't afford to live. But you still may need to have somewhere to live in case you get a job, or so you can continue to look for a job, or just something for your family. And so Hoovervilles developed. They're signs of desperation, not of revolution. But that's how state and local officials saw it. So state and local officials did everything they could to destroy these Hoovervilles. They would create laws making squatting illegal. They would create laws saying that women and children could not be in a Hooverville, with the idea if you broke up families, then it would limit the number of people in a Hooverville. They would go down and arrest the people living in a Hooverville, hold them in, like in jail or in some other place, and then bulldoze the Hooverville to destroy it so that people hopefully wouldn't go live there. Didn't matter. As soon as these individuals were released, as soon as local authorities left, people flocked right back to them. It was not a sign of defiance to the authorities, although I'm sure there were those individuals who lived in Hoovervilles who did see it as a sign of defiance. It was a reflection of the fact that people were desperate. They had nowhere to go. And so, in effect, what you had was state and local governments trying to criminalize poverty, trying to figure out a way to make it illegal for people to be homeless and live in these areas. But at the end of the day, you can criminalize poverty. You can criminalize homelessness. But if people don't have anywhere to go, particularly in a situation like the Great Depression where there's just no economic opportunity, they're going to live there. And that's what happens. This happens nationally, but I wanted you to be aware it is something that occurs in Washington. By the way, if you're curious where the Seattle Hooverville was, next time you go to a Mariners or a Seahawks game, that area of Seattle is where it was. It's kind of where those stadiums are today. All right. So the economic situation in Washington was difficult and challenging, and there was widespread poverty. The other thing you have to understand is that Washington during the Depression sees an influx of migrants. Beginning in the 1930s, migrants from the Great Plains in the South escaping the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl is really a topic for U.S. history too, so I'm not going to get into it much. But basically, you had a man-made environmental catastrophe on the Great Plains and in the South, in which people's farming techniques had led to widespread erosion of the soil of the Great Plains. And as a consequence of that widespread erosion, combined with some drought, the farmland just became, non-arable. You couldn't farm it. And as a consequence, a lot of these farmers and farm laborers lost everything, and then they had to go elsewhere to look for work, and many of them came west. And we call this the Okie migration after people from Oklahoma, right? But if you live in parts of Washington, it's often called the Arkie migration after people from Arkansas, because in certain parts of Washington, it was people from Arkansas who came and escaped the Dust Bowl and the poverty to come up this way. That's how my mother's family actually got up here, as they were part of that migration to this region as a consequence of that. But it's called the Okie migration. It's basically when you get people from the Great Plains escaping the conditions of the Great Depression and the environmental ecological catastrophe of the Dust Bowl, right? So think Oklahoma, which is what gives the namesake to the Okie migration. Texas, Kansas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Louisiana, Nebraska, all migrating out west. Why west? Well, because all throughout American history, we have sold the West as the land of opportunity. And if you recall back to our previous lectures on the selling of Washington, Washington had been sold as a place of plenty, as a New Eden. And so people remembered those things. They remembered those ad campaigns and they said, well, let's go seek out that life in Washington and the Pacific Northwest that was sold to us. At least 200,000 throughout the 1930s. 200,000 people from the Great Plains in the South migrate up here as part of the Okie migration. Now, that is largely a white migration, but we also get significant African American populations migrating to the Pacific Northwest in search for work. You also get people fleeing the poverty in industrial towns back east, coming to Washington looking for work. In short, you get lots of different groups migrating out here looking for work because of the way the West had been romanticized in the 19th and early 20th century, but also the active ad campaigns of places like Washington State that had actively recruited residents to develop the economy and resources of the region. So you get this migration occurring. But of course, there isn't much work, and so it just adds to the strains on society. Now, the New Deal will change some of that equation. It will change some of that equation. Just to remind you, the New Deal is Franklin Roosevelt's term for the economic policies that he's going to implement in the US. And just to be clear, these are pretty radical policies. The United States has never directly invested in the economy on such a scale before Roosevelt's administration. Roosevelt is using government money to try and jumpstart the economy. It's something that we actually take for granted today. We continue to do that. We look to the government to help assist when economies are contracting or there's economic hardship. But this is new in the 1930s for an American government to do such a thing. And so the Roosevelt administration is really trying to figure out how best to do this because it's an untested hypothesis. It's an untested theory at this point. Now, what Roosevelt and his advisors and cabinet officials and policymakers are trying to do is figure out how best to spend American money. And they have a variety of programs, right? We talked about the New Deal programs in that previous lecture, so I'm not going to go through it again. But I do want you to understand the programs that were very, very specifically in Washington, right? And in Washington, you had the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right? Trying to help out Washington agriculture. Now, if you recall, there's like 7 or so agriculture industries that the Roosevelt administration is looking to assist with respect to the New Deal, right? Washington doesn't have all those crops, but Washington does have wheat, which is one of the crops that the New Deal is trying to prop up. Washington also does have dairy products. We have a dairy industry here. And we have some corn and hogs, which were also covered by the New Deal. And so Washington farmers begin to see some stabilization and some assistance from the Agricultural Adjustment Act with the New Deal. A lot of the New Deal focused on developing America's national parks and national forests. We had them before the New Deal, right? It's not like we talked about how the creation of national parks and national forests before in the late 19th and into the early 20th century, especially during the Progressive era. But these parks were largely inaccessible to the general public. They were land set aside for preservation, but that's all that they were. What the Roosevelt administration decided is that the parks should be of public benefit, and therefore they needed to be accessible. What did accessible mean? Well, they needed roads so that people could drive to them and drive around them. They needed hiking trails, so when they were there, people could hike to them. They needed lodges so that when people wanted to go to these parks, they could stay there, right? They needed museums and bathrooms and all the infrastructure we take for granted in the national parks today. If you've ever been to the national parks or national monuments or some of the national forests, all that infrastructure that is there it began with the New Deal, right? And particularly a group called the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was responsible for a lot of this. But also the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and the PWA, the Public Works Administration. So Washington, because it has a lot of national park and national forest land, will benefit from this kind of development, right? People are being put to work doing this, and then the legacy will live on beyond the project. But one of the most important impact of the New Deal in Washington is going to be the investment in our infrastructure, particularly the dams. In the United States, prior to the New Deal, electricity had been around for decades. And most cities, well, not most, all American cities were electrified by this point. Most American towns were electrified by this point. But when you got to rural areas, there was very little electricity, if any, in most of rural America. Why was that? Why were the cities and some towns, and you had to be a decent sized town, small towns, no, but a decent sized town and most American urban areas were electrified. The question is why? Why were they electrified versus rural America and small towns not being electrified? Well, it was a question of how electricity was produced in this country. It was produced in this country largely by private companies. For-profit businesses, for-profit companies, for-profit corporations who built coal power plants, or who built dams to use hydroelectricity to supply a town or a city, or some sort of mixed use between burning fossil fuels and then maybe a dam to produce electricity. Whatever the case is, right, the electricity in America was done by corporations, by privately held companies who did this on a for-profit basis. They were trying to make money by providing power. And because cities were areas with lots of potential consumers of electricity, you would electrify to provide for cities because you could guarantee yourself a profit. There's no profit in rural America. There's no profit in small towns. But electricity was really, really important, not just for people's lives and improving the quality of their lives, although it was important for those reasons. Electricity was important because electricity was increasingly critical to economic activity. If you could generate enough electricity, you could power certain economic industries. The problem is that private companies were never going to make that investment because of the investment cost was too high for the return you might get, or the uncertainty of whatever return you would get. And so large parts of the America remain, were not electrified. The New Deal changed that because the New Deal said they were going to invest in the infrastructure of the United States, particularly electricity. And so what they did was they looked around and they said, right? They looked around and they said, where is the best use of our resources to do these major building projects? Well, Washington was one of those places. They looked at the Columbia River and said there's an enormous amount of hydroelectric potential there. And so they started two large projects in 1933 in Washington. One is Grand Coulee Dam, which is still the largest dam in the United States, and at the time was the largest dam in the world. And then Bonneville Dam, which is on the lower part of the Columbia River. These two dams were begun. They were under the authority of the Works Progress Administration, and they hired thousands upon thousands of workers to build them. And these dams were going to generate electricity that could then be provided in the region. They were also going to provide irrigation water, but that was a secondary project, and we'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. And because the government was the one doing the building, the government owned the dams. And what the federal government will decide to do, and we'll talk about this in a subsequent lecture, is the government will still own some of the dams, not all of them, but some of them. But the power itself will belong to the people. It's called public power. And so what happens is that the government begins to encourage the development of local public power, of local public utility districts, or PUDs, in order to manage power and maybe invest in the development of further infrastructure. Now keep in mind, this is the government investing in infrastructure and then turning ownership of it over to the public. And in doing so, it keeps electricity affordable in ways that it never would be if these were privately held projects and privately held infrastructure projects. It's a pretty remarkable development. And these dams are the most visible and important investment the New Deal makes in the state of Washington. And without these dams, you would not have the basis for Washington's modern economy, even to this day, and especially to this day, which we'll talk more about later. Since we're on the subject of dams, I think it's worth talking about what these dams do to Native peoples. So if you recall, right, we are now beginning in 1887. We are in what historians call the period of allotment and assimilation with respect to American Indian policy, the federal government's policy of the tribes. Through the Indian Allotment Act and subsequent other acts of legislation, reservations have been divided up into allotments given to individual heads of household of the tribe, and then whatever is left over is sold off to non-tribal members. And then, of course, we've had the Indian schools, which are forced assimilation of Native peoples. That policy is going to end during the Great Depression under the Roosevelt administration. So in 1934, Roosevelt sponsors through Congress what's called the Indian Reorganization Act. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. It's often called the Indian New Deal. What the Indian Reorganization Act does, and it's very, very important, is it ends the period of allotment and assimilation. So it ends the selling off of the land. It allows the tribes to begin to recover. Now, the land that had been sold off is sold off. It's still in private property. But if land wasn't sold off, it is held in trust by the federal government for the tribes. And the period of forced assimilation and Indian children being forced to go to Indian schools, the war on Indian culture is suspended for the moment. It's suspended for the moment. Those are all really positive developments. Roosevelt was quite popular among Native Americans and Native American leaders. And even to this day, by most indigenous groups, Roosevelt is remembered fondly for ending the assimilation allotment era. That doesn't mean the Indian schools disappear. They're still there. It's just this period of kidnapping children and an attack on Indian culture and language is suspended. But depending on where you live, and particularly in Washington, the New Deal has negative consequences for Native peoples. The dams were built on Native lands. Grand Coulee is built on land that had been part of the Colville Indian Reservation. And even when dams aren't built on tribal land, they still have impact on tribes. So the Bonneville Dam, the reservoir behind the dam eliminated Celilo Falls. And that was the traditional fishing areas of lots of tribes in both Washington and in Oregon. Same thing happens with Grand Coulee, right? The dam itself eliminates traditional fishing grounds, which is a violation of the treaty signed by the federal government with these tribes that guaranteed them access to their fishing grounds. And so you had many of these dams or public infrastructure projects across the country built on native land without their consent. So on the one hand, the Indian Reorganization Act, the Indian New Deal, is very beneficial for tribes across the country and tribes in the state of Washington, but it does have some negative side effects. So to conclude, the New Deal results in enormous investment in Washington. And the conditions of the Great Depression combined with the New Deal bring new migrants to Washington, particularly the Okie migrants, but also African American populations. The New Deal will provide an infrastructure to the state of Washington that will be the basis of its modern economy. However, the New Deal, while bringing hope to a lot of people and bringing jobs to a lot of people, it doesn't solve the economic conditions of the Great Depression. So in the next lecture, we'll talk about what does. The coming of World War II and the America's involvement in the war. I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.